What if I told you that the entire global economy, the flow of trillions of dollars, the military supply chains spanning the globe, even the international food networks that keep our cities fed, what if none of that is actually controlled by the presidents or prime ministers or, the billionaire CEOs you see on the news every single night?
Right, which sounds completely absurd on its face.
It really does. Because what if the actual structural power holding this whole modern world together is being wielded by, like, a handful of marine insurance adjusters you have literally never heard of?
Yeah, we are so heavily conditioned to look for power at the very top of an organizational chart, right? Or, behind a podium at some big press conference.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we are tearing down today.
Hmm.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Hmm?
Today we are attempting something completely wild. We are going to map the invisible architecture of power in the modern world. And I want you, the listener, to just pause for a second and really think about how you consume information.
It's important to reflect on that.
Yeah, because you look at a chaotic news cycle,
Hmm.
right? Like a massive global shipping crisis in the Red Sea, or some sweeping new artificial intelligence policy out of Washington, or a completely unexplained violent shift in the global financial markets.
Yeah.
And you inevitably ask yourself, how does this all actually connect?
And honestly, it is the defining question of our era. The problem is that the answers we traditionally get are deeply, deeply unsatisfying. They tend to fall into two extreme, fundamentally flawed camps.
Right.
So on one side, you have this incredibly naive institutional view. This is the idea that the world operates in total isolated silos. Like the government does its government thing over here, the free market does its market thing over there, and the scientific community is just off in a laboratory completely independent of both.
Which we instinctively know is false. We see the collision of those worlds every single time we open a newspaper.
Exactly.
But then, because that first explanation feels so hollow, people rubber band all the way to the other extreme, which is the grand conspiracy theory.
Right, the smoke-filled room.
Yeah, the idea that if things are completely random, they must be secretly controlled by this shadowy global hierarchy, a dozen people sitting in a back room somewhere pulling the strings of every major event on Earth.
And, the conspiracy model is psychologically comforting in a weird way. It implies that at least someone is driving the bus, even if they're nefarious. But neither the silo model nor the conspiracy model actually reflects reality.
Which is why we're here today.
Yes. That brings us to our source material today, which is a truly groundbreaking framework. It was published on August 22, 2026, and it's titled Relay Atlas, a technical framework for mapping institutional influence, functional bottlenecks, and relay-shaped power.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the entire mission of this research is to prove that the truth of how the world works isn't found in those silos, and it isn't found in secret hierarchies. It's found in something they call multiplex relays,
Multiplex relays, yes.
which, that sounds like a piece of networking hardware from the 1990s. If it's not a hierarchy and it's not a silo, what does a multiplex relay actually look like out in the wild?
So, you have to think of a relay not as a command structure, but as a highly specific relationship. It's where a consequential resource is passed between totally different institutional domains. Power in this framework isn't about one giant group owning everything.
Right.
It is about highly specialized organizations connected by very specific, very narrow flows. You have flows of capital, flows of legal authority, scientific expertise, physical materials, and flows of risk.
Right.
So power doesn't sit at the top of a pyramid. Power sits in the relays themselves, literally in the act of passing the baton.
Okay, but to understand how this relay atlas actually maps all that out, we really first have to look under the hood. We need to understand the map itself, like the data architecture holding this entire massive project together.
And the scale here is staggering.
It really is. We are looking at a current graph that contains 564 nodes and 1,280 relationships. And those are distributed across 43 distinct functional layers.
Yeah, and they've pulled data from 82 registered sources, and they track 27 explicitly quantified flows.
Which is just a massive amount of data. But to appreciate what they've built, you really have to look at how they define a node. Because if you look at a typical corporate org chart, a node is always just a person or a company. Right. The CEO is a node. The VP of marketing is a node. Exactly. But the Relay Atlas is what they call heterogeneous. Yes, the graph includes 64 actual people and 500 distinct organizations, but it also includes physical choke points, institutional markets, analytical objects, and even specific historical events.
It's a really fascinating departure from how we usually think about networks.
It really is. So in this atlas, someone like Elon Musk could be a node, the Department of Defense could be a node, But the actual physical concrete of the Panama Canal is also treated as an active participant in the network.
It absolutely has to be. If your goal is to understand how a localized shipping crisis in Central America ultimately dictates, corporate finance decisions in London or Tokyo, you cannot leave out the physical geography.
Wow, yeah.
The choke point itself exerts a massive structural force on the network. But the real genius of this architecture, the thing that keeps it from just being a messy pile of random data, lies in what the researchers call typed edges.
Let's slow down on that term for a second, because this is where the precision really comes into play. In network science, the node is the entity, and the edge is the line drawn between two nodes.
Right.
But the Relay Atlas insists that a line is never just a generic connection. Saying two things are connected tells you absolutely nothing about the power dynamic between them.
Precisely. Because if I draw a line between institution A and institution B, what does that actually mean? Did they have coffee? Did one buy the other? Did one regulate the other out of existence?
Okay.
So the atlas specifically types every single connection. You have edges that represent service and board off, which is a personnel link. But then you also have edges for awards contracts, underwrites, or even carry Essaborni oil flow.
It's a level of semantic discipline that you just rarely see in these kinds of sweeping geopolitical analyses. An edge that means owns some majority stake in carries a completely different gravitational pull than an edge that just means provides non-binding advisito.
Oh, absolutely. If you don't define the exact nature of the flow, you just end up with this messy hairball of meaningless red string on a corkboard. The typed edges let us see the actual metabolic process of the global system. What is being consumed and what is being passed along.
Which brings us to arguably the most critical feature of the entire methodology, because the researchers are walking a very, very dangerous tightrope here.
They are.
They are pulling in thousands of documented facts, sure, but they're also actively trying to map out hypotheses about how influence might work in the shadows.
Yes, and that is a crucial distinction.
Hold on, though, because this is exactly where my alarm bells start ringing. If we are actively including hypotheses, basically guesses, on the exact same map as documented hard facts, doesn't that literally create the exact conspiracy board nonsense we are trying so hard to avoid?
It's a completely valid concern.
Like if I look at the map and see a line connecting a defense contractor to a regulatory policy, how do I know if that's a proven fact or just some researcher's hunch?
And that is exactly why the Atlas utilizes what they call a dual ledger system. It is this incredibly strict accounting mechanism that explicitly separates observable reality from proposed mechanisms.
Let's look at Ledger A first.
Okay, Ledger A.
Ledger A is the documented core. It represents 61.6% of all the edges in the entire graph. These were official rosters, public financial records, legally documented transactions. So if a public SEC filing shows that person X sits on the board of corporation Y, that edge goes into Ledger A. It is indisputable, observable reality.
Okay, so that's the bedrock. That's the hard stuff. But then we have Ledger B, which makes up about 14% of the edges. And this is the hypothesis layer. This is where you map out potential influence channels.
Right.
So, for example, a Ledger B edge might propose a mechanism like academic research output fundamentally shapes later government policy priorities. Exactly. It's an incredibly plausible mechanism. It makes intuitive sense to most people, but it is an inference. It is not something you can usually prove with a single legally binding document.
Right.
And beyond just separating these two ledgers, the researchers also grade the evidence into tiers. Tier 1 is a direct primary source, like a contract or a government charter, and that makes up over 61% of the edges.
That's a solid chunk.
It is. Then Tier 2 might be documented, but maybe it's aggregated or slightly older data. And Tier 3 is functional inference, where there is absolutely zero implication of coordinated intent. By strictly separating the claim type, so fact versus hypothesis, from the source quality, they prevent the map from collapsing into one giant, misleading influence score.
I want to try and translate this to something that, we all interact with every single day. Social media.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. So on a platform like Twitter or Instagram, if you look at Ledger A, those are the documented facts. I follow a specific account. That is a verifiable Tier 1 fact. The platform's database completely confirms it. But Ledger B would be someone looking at my profile and claiming, well, because you follow that account, you agree with all of their political views, and you actively coordinate your voting behavior with them. Following someone is a fact. Endorsing them or coordinating with them is a hypothesis.
That beautifully distinguishes structural opportunity from demonstrated intent. The fact that an architectural connection exists between two people or two organizations does not mathematically prove they are coordinating.
I get that, but I'm still stuck on this one thing. Why put ledger B on the map at all? Like, if it's just a hypothesis, even if it's visually separated with a different color or whatever, isn't it still inherently muddying the water?
It would, except that every ledger B relationship in the atlas is required to have an associated falsifier.
A falsifier. Okay, what is that?
This is their ultimate epistemic safeguard. A falsifier is a highly specific evidentiary condition that, if proven true, would immediately reject the hypothesis and force the edge to be entirely deleted from the map.
Well,
Yeah, you aren't just throwing wild guesses onto a whiteboard. You are placing testable mechanisms onto the map. So if you hypothesize that a specific laboratory's research output shapes defense policy, you have to define, in advance, what specific evidence would prove that assumption completely wrong.
that is brilliant.
It really allows researchers to explore the blurry, unseen pathways of influence without silently converting their guesses into established facts.
Okay, I love that. It's actual scientific rigor applied to political science and economics, which, let's be honest, is desperately needed. So we have this incredibly disciplined map. We have 564 nodes. We have typed edges that tell us exactly what is flowing. And we have strict ledgers separating the hard facts from the testable hypotheses.
We have the foundation.
Right. So now that we have the map laid out in front of us, how do we actually find out who is in charge? Because when you look at the raw data in this atlas, it reveals this fundamental truth about power, which is that being popular is absolutely not the same thing as being powerful.
Not even close. When you analyze a network, there are a few different ways to measure how important a node is. The most intuitive, obvious one is called degree.
Degree.
Yes. Degree is simply a count of the sheer number of direct connections a node has. How many edges point toward you or point away from you? In the Relay Atlas, the average degree across the whole network is 4.46. The absolute maximum for a single node is 55. If you have a high degree, you are a massive hub. You basically have your fingers in a lot of different pies.
But wait, if I'm, say, a local regional bank in the Midwest, and I do business with 50 other local regional businesses in my same county, my degree is going to be incredibly high. I have 50 connections. I look like this massive glowing hub on the map. But I have zero structural power over the global economy. Doesn't this metric completely fail to measure actual influence?
You've hit on the exact limitation of degree. You can absolutely be the biggest fish in a tiny, isolated pond, but you have no leverage over the broader ecosystem. Which brings us to the second, far more sophisticated metric. And this is where the true architecture of power really reveals itself. It's called betweenness centrality.
Okay, let's really dig into this, because betweenness centrality feels like the key that unlocks this entire paper.
It is. Betweenness centrality measures the fraction of shortest paths between other nodes that traverse a given node.
Okay, that sounds like a lot of math jargon.
I know. Let's break it down in plain English.
Yeah.
It essentially asks, how often do two completely different, unrelated parts of the global system have to go through you to reach each other? To give you a sense of scale, the approximate mean path length in this entire graph is 4.28, meaning, on average, any two entities on this map are about 4 steps away from each other.
That's pretty close.
It is. And the diameter, which is the absolute longest path between any two nodes on opposite sides of the map, is 10.
So, betweenness centrality isn't about how many friends you have. It's about whether you are the only person who can introduce two completely different friend groups to each other.
Exactly.
Let's look at who actually holds the highest betweenness in the global system, because the list of the top nodes here is just wild. The absolute highest is this synthetic node called the U.S. decision system with a score of 0.413.
Right.
And we'll talk about what a synthetic node is in a minute, because that's a whole separate plot twist. But looking at the actual empirical institutions, you have the Department of Defense, Capital Markets, the SEC, the Insurance Investment Capital Pool, the Carlyle Group, WTC7, the Associated Press, and General Dynamics.
It's a really fascinating cross-section of military, financial, and informational choke points. But what's fascinating here is that there is one node on this list that perfectly illustrates the profound difference between a hub and a bridge. It is the ultimate example of relay-shaped power, and that is the global marine insurance market.
Yes. When I read this part of the source material, my jaw literally dropped. The global marine insurance market has a degree of only 6 connections. That is practically nothing compared to the massive hubs on the board.
Nothing at all.
And yet, it's Between centralness and centrality, its structural leverage over the global system massively outranks highly connected, famous organizations. How does an institution with only 6 direct relationships become one of the most structurally powerful nodes on planet Earth?
To understand that, we have to trace the specific relay path it occupies. The researchers map out the sequence so brilliantly, and it shows you exactly how abstract finance is chained to brute physical reality.
Okay, walk me through it.
Let's say you want to move 10,000 electric vehicles from a factory in Shanghai to a port in Rotterdam. You start with physical trade. That's the actual goods moving on the ocean. But the second you put those cars on a boat, you conjure a massive amount of marine risk.
Right, the danger of the ship hitting a reef or catching fire or even being hijacked.
Exactly, and the ocean is dangerous. Those cars are worth tens of millions of dollars. The shipping company isn't going to just gamble that money, so that physical risk mandates insurance. They have to buy a policy.
That makes sense.
But a single sunken cargo ship could bankrupt a normal insurance company. The financial liability is just too concentrated. So that primary insurance requires reinsurance. The insurance companies have to buy insurance for themselves to offload that catastrophic systemic risk.
Oh, wow.
And that global reinsurance market requires absolutely vast oceanic pools of capital to back it up.
So the path is this unyielding chain of dependencies. Physical trade dictates marine risk dictates insurance dictates reinsurance, and reinsurance dictates global capital.
You've got it. And the global marine insurance market sits right in the dead center of that path. It is the indispensable bridge between the physical reality of a cargo ship floating in the water and the abstract reality of a hedge fund manager moving numbers on a screen in Manhattan.
That is wild.
The marine insurance adjuster doesn't need 50 connections to be powerful. They only need to control the one single narrow choke point that everyone else is forced to use.
It makes me think of city traffic, honestly. Imagine a massive mega mall parking lot right before the holidays. It has dozens of exits, hundreds of cars constantly moving in and out.
Yeah.
Incredibly high activity. That is high degree.
Right.
It's chaotic, it's busy, it's highly connected. But then you have a single, narrow, 2-lane bridge that connects the north side of a city to the south side over a really deep river. That bridge only has 2 connections, one piece of road on the north, one piece on the south. That is low degree.
Yes.
But if you want to completely control the flow of commerce, labor, and emergency services in that city, you don't stand in the middle of the mega mall parking lot waving your arms around. You put a toll booth on the bridge. That is high betweenness.
That is a perfect analogy. And what this atlas proves mathematically is that global influence is primarily about occupying those specific spaces between otherwise totally distinct domains. It's the space between physical logistics and capital, the space between scientific discovery and military procurement. True structural leverage doesn't live in the center of the silo, it lives in the hallway connecting the silos.
Which naturally brings up a pretty terrifying thought experiment, if we're being honest. If the global system is so incredibly reliant on these narrow, specific bridges, these high-betweenness nodes, what happens if one of those bridges collapses? Like, what happens to the city if the river bridge washes away?
The researchers wanted to quantify exactly that, so they ran what they call percolation-style resilience experiments.
Percolation style, like a coffee maker.
The math is actually very similar. In physics, percolation theory looks at how fluids move through porous materials, like water filtering through coffee grounds. If you pack the grounds too tight, the water can't find a continuous path and the flow just stops. In network science, you apply this by systematically deleting nodes from the network to see at what exact point the flow of connectivity breaks down and the network shatters into isolated puddles. They played a digital game of destruction with the atlas. They deleted nodes in 2 different ways, totally at random and highly strategically.
The numbers they got back from this are just stunning. Let's look at the random failure first. Because when they removed 10% of the nodes from the graph completely at random, just literally closing their eyes and deleting 56 institutions, the system barely even noticed. A massive 94.7% of the network remained connected in one giant component.
It shows that complex systems are incredibly robust against random noise. You could randomly wipe out 1/10 of the organizations on this map. You know, a regional bank here, a local shipping firm there, a mid-tier defense subcontractor, and the global economy largely routes around the damage and just keeps talking to itself.
But then they stopped being random. They ran the simulation again, and this time they removed 10% of the nodes strategically. They actively targeted the nodes with the highest betweenness centrality. They took out the bridges.
And when they did that, the connected network collapsed from 94.7% down to just 8.1%.
That is a massive drop.
And the decay curve gets radically steeper from there. If you strategically remove the top 15% of high centrality nodes, the network connectivity drops to 2.3%. Remove 20% of the bridge nodes, and the network shrinks to a mere 1.8%. The entire architecture completely shatters into hundreds of tiny, blind, isolated fragments that can no longer communicate with each other.
I want to make sure we are translating these abstract percentages into real-world reality for a second. If network connectivity drops to 2.3%, what does that actually mean for you as a listener? It means if you take out just 15% of the key organizations, say a specific marine insurer, a major data clearinghouse, and a central regulatory body, a defense contractor in Virginia literally cannot execute a legally binding contract with a microchip manufacturer in Taiwan.
Exactly.
The pathway just no longer exists.
The researchers summarize this beautifully. They state that the institutional network is locally redundant, yet globally dependent on a comparatively small set of bridge functions.
Locally redundant, globally dependent.
Yes. Local redundancy means that if a random local hospital fails, another local hospital steps in to take the patients. The system adapts locally. But global dependence means if the narrow bridge connecting, say, catastrophe insurance to global capital vanishes, the local adaptations cannot save it. The whole system fractures.
It's Jenga. It is exactly like a game of Jenga.
Yep.
You can be blindfolded and poke out random wooden blocks from the outside edges of the tower all day long. The tower might wobble, it might look precarious, but it stands. That's random removal. But if you are calculating and you pull the one specific load-bearing block in the dead center of the lower structure, the entire tower instantly turns into a pile of splinters on your coffee table.
It is Jenga, but with a crucial human twist. Because imagine if the Jenga pieces were actively rewriting legal contracts and forming new alliances to try and save themselves as the tower started to tip. That's the difference between a wooden block and a human institution.
And that leads to a really necessary pushback here. Because when I read that deleting 10% of the nodes drops the global network to 8% connectivity, my immediate response is sheer panic. I mean, does this mean if a coordinated attack took out the top 10% of institutions tomorrow, 92% of the modern world would physically cease to function? Are we really living on a razor's edge from total societal collapse?
We definitely have to step back from the apocalyptic framing here. The researchers are very, very careful to temper that exact reaction. This network deletion is what they call a structural counterfactual.
Okay, meaning what?
It is a mathematical exercise to prove dependency. It is not a real-world simulation of an apocalypse. The map shows us the pathways of least resistance that exist today.
Right, because in the real world, human beings don't just sit there and accept that the bridge is gone. They do something about it.
Exactly. Institutions are dynamic and they are fiercely active. If a major high-betweenness bridge institution collapsed overnight, there would absolutely be short-term chaos.
Sure.
But almost immediately, competitors would scramble to enter that incredibly lucrative space. Emergency legislation would be passed, legal contracts would be completely rewritten, and new, albeit less efficient pathways would be forged. What this percolation data proves is an extreme structural dependency on our current bridges and the potential for massive friction if they fail. It does not prove that human society would just stop existing.
Okay. My blood pressure is slightly lowering. But before we permanently declare this network a fragile, highly connected web of doom, there's a massive methodological plot twist halfway through this paper.
There really is.
A twist in how the data was actually gathered and displayed that completely upends the narrative we've been building for the last half hour.
Ah, yes. The sensitivity analysis. This is where the researchers demonstrate a level of epistemic humility that you almost never see in academic publishing.
It's refreshing.
It is. Up until now, everything we've been discussing, the 94% connectivity, the sweeping global pathways, it has all been based on the full project graph. This master graph is 100% connected. It looks like one giant unified web of global power.
But the researchers willingly raise their hands and say, hey, wait a minute. We need to confess something about this master graph. They admit that this full graph contains synthetic nodes. We touched on this briefly earlier. The node with the absolute highest between-us centrality on the entire map was called the U.S. decision system.
Right. And the glaring problem is the U.S. decision system does not exist in physical reality.
You can't visit it.
No, you cannot pull up Google Maps, type in U.S. decision system, and drive to a building. You can't sue it, and you certainly can't shake hands with its CEO. It is a conceptual layer. It is an analytical category that the researchers basically created out of thin air to help organize the massive complexity of the data.
Got it.
The master project graph also includes ontology nodes, institutional market nodes, and historical events.
So the researchers asked themselves a terrifyingly honest question. What happens if we remove all of our own analytical concepts? What happens if we strip away the synthetic nodes, the market concepts, and the physical choke points, and we only look at the actual literal actors, the real human beings, the real corporations, and the real government agencies?
They created what they call a conservative actor-oriented projection. They stripped the 564 heterogeneous nodes down to just 472 pure actor-like nodes.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh yeah, because when they reran the visualization, the picture completely shattered. The giant, unified, 100% connected web broke apart into 184 separate, entirely disconnected pieces.
The transformation in the math is just staggering. In this pure actor graph, the largest single connected piece of the network contains only 199 nodes. That is only about 42.2% of the actors. Less than half the board is even talking to each other.
It's wild.
And it gets even more fragmented. If you take that pure actor graph and you exclude ledger B, meaning you wipe all the hypotheses off the board and only look at legally documented Tier 1 and Tier 2 facts, the largest connected component shrinks to just 35%.
The irony here is profound. The only reason the master graph showed that everything is connected is because the researchers themselves literally inserted conceptual bridges to link them together.
It is the ultimate lesson in not mistaking the map for the territory. They built this incredibly sophisticated tool, but they are the very first ones to publish a giant flashing warning sign about where the tool's inherent biases lie. They aren't trying to sell a grand unified theory of global control if the raw, literal data doesn't fully support it yet.
They state it with total clarity. The statement, "The institutional network is one connected system," is currently a property of their analytical model. It is a really useful way to think about the world, but it is not yet a proven, demonstrated reality of actual people and organizations interacting with one another. This is why they demand that the project graph and the actor graph must be reported side by side.
It changes everything about how we view power. I mean, if the entire global system isn't just one giant monolithic web of billionaires shaking hands in a boardroom, how does influence actually travel? How do you bridge the gap between those 184 separate isolated pieces?
To answer that, the researchers step away from the macro-level statistics and they give us a microscopic, real-world case study. They dissect the anatomy of a multiplex relay by mapping out the Department of Energy's Energy Innovation System.
Yes.
This section of the paper is brilliant because it proves the atlas isn't just drawing lines between dots, it is analyzing the actual mechanics of how power is transmitted. They break this specific relay down into 5 highly distinct stages.
Let's spend some time walking through this because this DOE example fundamentally rewired how I think about government spending. Let's trace a hypothetical piece of next-generation battery technology moving through these 5 stages.
Sure. So stage 1 is appropriations. This is the origin point of the relay. This is the flow of legal authority and actual dollars from the U.S. Congress to the Department of Energy's budget.
Okay.
This is purely documented, Ledger A, public record. Congress passes a law, the president signs it, and the DOE is authorized to spend $1 billion on energy innovation.
Simple enough. But then we hit stage 2, which is program selection. That massive pool of money enters specific program offices inside the DOE, like ARPAE or the Office of Science. And this is where the paper highlights a mechanism they call selection pressure. And this is the fulcrum of power.
Because a program manager at ARPA does not act like a bank teller. They don't just stand behind a window and automatically hand out cash to whatever scientist walks up and asks for it. The program manager exerts immense structural power over the future of science.
How do they do that?
Their power isn't in telling a scientist exactly what chemical compound to discover. That's impossible to predict. Their power is in defining the solicitations. They write the technical topics. They set the eligibility boundaries for who can even apply in the first place.
Right. If the program manager writes a solicitation that says, we are only funding research into solid-state lithium batteries, and you must partner with a domestic manufacturer, they have just instantly defunded any researcher working on liquid flow batteries. By deciding what is even allowed to be funded, the program manager exerts immense selection pressure on the entire scientific community. They don't give the orders, but they write the menu of options.
Which brings us to stage 3, performers. The money has passed through the selection gate and actually reaches the national labs, the research universities, and the defense contractors. And what the atlas maps here is the incredible complexity of the principal and agent problem.
It's never a straight line.
Never. It is never a direct line from the president to the scientist. Congress gives authority to the DOE. The DOE delegates to a program office. The program office awards a grant to a management contractor. That contractor operates a national laboratory, and inside that laboratory, a specific team of scientists actually does the work.
So many steps.
It is a deeply layered chain of accountability, and at every link in that chain, the incentives shift slightly.
The baton is being passed, but every runner has a slightly different motivation. Then the scientists actually do the work. They discover something. This produces stage 4, which is epistemic and policy feedback. The laboratory publishes data sets, they train a new generation of PhDs, they generate new technical expertise that enters the public domain. And the structural theory is that this new knowledge systematically loops back and shapes the future policy priorities of Congress.
Exactly.
But notice, the researchers immediately classify this stage as Ledger B.
Because it is inferential. You almost never find a Tier 1 legal document that says, because this specific laboratory in Oak Ridge published this specific data set on battery degradation, Senator Smith voted this way on an appropriations bill 5 years later. It is a highly plausible, historically observable loop, but it is technically a hypothesis.
And finally, we reach stage 5, commercialization and capital return. That public R&D eventually spills over into the private sector. It leads to new patented technologies. Those technologies form the basis of new startups. Those startups attract private venture capital. And eventually, those companies pay taxes or create geopolitical advantages that justify the original congressional appropriation.
And this is also classified as Ledger B because tracking that generalized macroeconomic loop requires longitudinal evidence spanning decades.
So when you look at this 5-stage relay, appropriations, program selection, performers, feedback, and commercialization, it creates a total paradigm shift in how we understand influence. It proves that institutional power in a complex society is almost never about giving direct, militaristic orders down a rigid chain of command.
It really is like a relay race, but the mechanics are totally twisted. Instead of forerunners passing a standardized aluminum baton on a neatly painted track, these institutions are passing authority, money, risk, and scientific legitimacy.
And the crazy part is, some of the runners get to dictate the rules of the race for the next person in line. The ARPAE program manager in Stage 2 decides what kind of shoes the university researcher in Stage 3 is allowed to wear.
That is the core realization of the paper. Power isn't about giving orders, it's about setting the menu of options, which brings the researchers to a formal concept that completely redefines the vocabulary of influence in the modern world. Selection gates.
Yes, the formula they introduce in this section is so mathematically simple, but so profound in its implications. Influence does not equal ownership alone. Just because you don't own the building doesn't mean you don't control every single thing that happens inside it. They redefine structural influence as a function of 6 specific variables: selection, access, allocation, constraint, information, and substitutability.
Let's apply this concept of selection gates across completely different domains because it scales beautifully.
Okay, let's do it.
In the world of government science, the selection gate is the grant review committee. In the military-industrial complex, it is the procurement office writing the requirements for a new jet fighter. In academia and media, it is the editorial review board deciding what actually gets published. In the world of decentralized finance and Bitcoin, it is the custody and settlement infrastructure that bridges fiat currency to crypto.
They are everywhere.
In every single one of these cases, the institution controlling the gate determines which candidates, which ideas, or which resources are allowed to move to the next stage of the relay.
I am looking at this and thinking of the perfect everyday analogy. It is exactly like a bouncer at an incredibly exclusive high-end nightclub.
Oh, let's expand on that, because the bouncer analogy actually hits all 6 variables of their formula.
Right. Because think about it. The bouncer does not own the nightclub. The bouncer does not own the $1 million sound system. They don't get to choose the music the DJ plays, and they certainly don't pay for the expensive drinks at the bar. But they stand at the velvet rope. They control access. They exert selection pressure. By dictating who gets in and who stays out, the bouncer fundamentally shapes the entire reality, the culture, and the financial success of that club. That is a selection gate. You don't need to own the club if you control the rope.
And this concept of gates and bottlenecks extends far beyond human institutional committees. because human choices do not happen in a vacuum. The Atlas takes this concept and applies it to what they call the physical constraint layer. They argue that institutional power is ultimately chained to brutal, unyielding material constraints.
This goes back to the maritime and energy infrastructure nodes we talked about earlier,
Exactly.
right? Let's use a real-world hypothetical that we actually saw happen not too long ago. Let's talk about the Suez Canal. The global economy heavily relies on energy moving from the Middle East to Europe. But you cannot just legislate a barrel of oil from one side of the world to the other. You can't just pass a law and magically teleport the energy.
No, you can't.
It has to physically go on a shipping vessel, which has to physically pass through the geographic choke point of the Suez Canal, which requires marine insurance, which requires global capital.
And if a single massive container ship gets wedged sideways in that canal, the entire global relay stops dead.
It just stops.
It doesn't matter what the U.S. decision system wants. It doesn't matter what Wall Street wants. The physical constraint layer exerts absolute veto power over the institutional layer. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is vital because this physical constraint layer acts as the ultimate truth serum for testing political narratives. You can debate political intentions, deep state conspiracies, and corporate greed indefinitely on cable news. It's all subjective. But physical throughput is a measurable mathematical reality.
The numbers don't lie.
Exactly. How many barrels of oil per day can physically move through the Strait of Hormuz? What is the actual quantified pricing of marine insurance premiums? The physical constraints can actually be used to scientifically test whether a political narrative is rooted in reality or fantasy.
Wait, hold on a second. If we are testing reality using measurable data, I have a massive problem with how we map these flows. Well, aren't not all edges equal? If we are mapping flows of influence and a tiny environmental nonprofit gives a $10,000 research grant to a college student, that is mapped as one edge. But if the Department of Defense awards a $50 billion contract to Lockheed Martin to build fighter jets, that is also mapped as one edge. If we're just counting the number of edges, aren't we vastly comically distorting the reality of power?
It is a critical flaw if you just look at the raw topology, and the researchers are highly aware of this. This is why the current architecture of the Atlas goes beyond simple lines and includes 27 explicitly quantified flows.
Okay, so they account for this.
Yes, they aren't just saying money moves, they are tracking the actual numbers. Maritime petroleum flows measured in barrels, shipping fleet size measured in gross tonnage, advertising revenue measured in dollars, Bitcoin custody amounts, insurance premiums, and proxy voting assets under management.
But you still can't just add those up, right? It's an apples-oranges problem on a global scale. You can't look at the spreadsheet and say, well, firm A has $10 million in revenue and firm B moved 10 million barrels of oil, so they have the exact same influence score.
Precisely. You cannot mathematically collapse heterogeneous quantities into one generic, meaningless influence score. The researchers explicitly state that future iterations of the graph require what they call dimension-aware weighting.
Dimension-aware weighting.
Yes. Dollars, barrels of physical oil, insured tonnage, and corporate voting assets are fundamentally different dimensional objects. $1 billion in venture capital does not exert the same type of structural force as $1 billion in catastrophic reinsurance. You have to evaluate the specific weight of the specific flow within its specific structural context.
Okay, so armed with this incredibly nuanced, dimension-aware understanding of selection gates between peepness, centrality, and physical constraints, the researchers did something incredibly satisfying.
They really did.
They took all the most popular cultural narratives about how the world works, the stuff you hear at Thanksgiving dinner or read on internet forums, and they aggressively ran them through the Atlas to see which ones survived the data.
It is a rigorous, highly analytical teardown of modern political and economic mythology. Let's look at the narratives that the data actually supports first.
Okay.
The strongest overall finding, Narrative I, confirms everything we've been talking about. Influence is a multiplex relay, not a universal conspiracy. The data shows incredibly deep, complex interdependence across finance, government, media, and logistics. But there is absolutely zero mathematical evidence of a universal top-down command hierarchy.
Another narrative that survived testing, Narrative 2, bottlenecks matter more than popularity. The data mathematically proves that controlling low substitutability functions is the real key to power. Low substitutability just means doing a job that no one else can easily step in and do.
Right.
If there are 50 marketing firms, you have high substitutability. If there is only one specialized data custodian, you have low substitutability and you have immense power. We also saw a strong support for narrative 4, which we just spent 10 minutes on.
Hmm.
Selection is a profound form of power.
But I want to circle back to narrative V, because this is perhaps the most surprising finding in the entire 60-page paper. Narrative V states, risk transfer, specifically insurance, is the hidden institutional infrastructure of the global economy.
Which perfectly validates our deep dive into the marine insurance market from earlier.
Exactly. Initially, to a casual observer, insurance seems like a peripheral, boring financial service industry. But when the researchers mathematically modeled real-world physical risks, insurance emerged as the ultimate cross-domain bridge. Because risk-bearing capacity is a brutally scarce resource. Catastrophe risk is the hidden structural chain linking physical, dirty maritime trade directly to pristine, abstract global capital markets. Without insurance, the physical world stops moving.
And finally, narrative 6 gets support. Personnel circulation creates structural continuity. This is the classic revolving door.
Oh, yeah, we see that all the time.
Right. When people serve on multiple corporate boards, or when a 4-star general retires and immediately joins the board of a defense contractor, it creates repeated personal bridges. The atlas confirms this definitely transmits expertise and access, though the researchers are careful to note that overlapping boards do not automatically mathematically prove they are colluding on an evil master plan.
Right. Correlation isn't coordination. But then we get to the fun part. The narratives that the data utterly destroys. These are the unsupported claims that fall apart when exposed to network science. First, a single organization controls the system.
Yep.
The data shows this is completely false. Centrality is highly distributed across multiple competing sectors.
Yeah.
There is no single puppet master pulling all the strings.
Second, destroyed narrative. Connectivity proves coordination. Again, false. This is back to our social media analogy. An edge on a graph documents a relationship. It does not document a shared, coordinated master plan.
Third, asset management equals ownership. You hear this all the time, that 2 or 3 massive asset management firms own the entire world.
You hear that everywhere.
The atlas explicitly dissects this. It shows that the legal custody of an asset, the right to vote on behalf of an asset, and the actual beneficial ownership of an asset are 3 highly distinct things. They cannot be lazily lumped together to claim one firm owns the global economy.
And finally, the most culturally pervasive, deeply entrenched narrative of the last decade, the deep state. The idea that a permanent, unelected bureaucracy secretly runs the world. The researchers argue this narrative is fundamentally analytically inferior.
And they explain exactly why it fails structurally. The deep state narrative presupposes the exact coordination structure it is trying to prove. If you assume a central hidden node exists, you ruin the math of betweenness centrality. You are forcing all the paths through a hidden node that you just invented in your head.
Right.
Network science requires you to let the paths form themselves based only on the documented data. The relay framework is far superior because it allows centralized coordination to be mathematically detected if it is actually present in the data, without requiring it as a lazy, paranoid initial assumption.
So what does this all mean? I am looking at this teardown of the deep state narrative, and I'm thinking about the psychology of the average person listening right now. If I am someone who, frankly, kind of believed there was a smoky back room where a dozen billionaires run the world, what am I supposed to take away from this? It's almost disorienting to have that narrative taken away.
It is disorienting, but I would encourage a pivot in how we apply critical thinking. The deep state narrative is, ultimately, a comforting fairy tale. It implies that someone, somewhere, is driving the bus, even if they are bad people. It implies control.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What the Relay Atlas reveals is actually much more terrifying, but mathematically accurate. Power is an emergent property. It emerges organically from highly specialized, incredibly myopic institutions acting purely on their own localized incentives.
They aren't trying to control the world. They are just trying to optimize their one specific relay.
Exactly. The world isn't run by a highly organized, omnipotent cabal. It relies heavily on fragile, highly unglamorous bottlenecks, like marine insurance adjusters, mid-level program managers at the DOE, or data custodians. These people don't have a master plan for the globe. They just happen to control the narrow, load-bearing bridges that everyone else is forced to cross.
It is a completely new, mathematically rigorous lens for viewing the news. But to their immense credit, the researchers are the first to admit this atlas is still a prototype. It is a work in progress. Where does this map go from here? What are the structural limitations they admit they still need to overcome?
They are brutally transparent about their limitations. First, graph completeness is uneven. They haven't mapped every institution on Earth. And in network science, just because an organization has low centrality on the current map might just mean the researchers haven't found the right FOIA documents yet. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Second, between narrowness centrality is a structural proxy. It shows where a path could go. It does not necessarily prove the actual volume of influence flowing through it at any given second.
And the temporal resolution limitation is absolutely massive here. The researchers point out a major flaw in static mapping. If you have a documented relationship between person X and person Y from 2001 and another documented relationship between person Y and person Z for 2026, the computer algorithm might link them together to form a pathway from X to Z.
But they might have never overlapped.
Right. In reality, person X and person Z might have never, ever overlapped in time. By flattening 25 years of data onto one map, you create these historical ghost paths that don't actually exist in reality anymore.
Which is exactly why their #1 technical priority for the future is adding strict temporal start and end dates to every single edge. Without time-stamped relationships, you are conflating history with current events. Once they add that temporal layer, they can move this entire project from descriptive mapping, showing what is, to predictive science, simulating what will happen when a node fails.
They also list some incredibly exciting future case studies they want to run through this framework. They want to move beyond the DOE and look at Department of Defense acquisition pipelines, NIH biomedical funding structures, semiconductor industrial policy, the custody mechanics of Bitcoin ETFs, and the incredibly fragile, critical mineral supply chains.
But knowing all of these limitations raises a very valid structural critique.
Right. I'm looking at this list of flaws, blind spots, uneven data, historical ghost paths, and I have to ask, if the map is currently this flawed, can we actually trust its sweeping conclusions about power, bottlenecks, and the death of the deep state narrative?
We trust it specifically because it admits its limitations and defines the exact evidentiary standards required to fix them. The greatest achievement of the Relay Atlas isn't that it successfully mapped a secret global hierarchy, it's that it built a rigorous, falsifiable scientific framework where every single competing theory of power can be tested against the exact same data.
That's powerful.
It is. If you believe in free market theory, if you believe in state capacity theory, or if you firmly believe in the revolving door theory, you can plug your assumptions into the atlas and see if the math holds up. It completely replaces screaming arguments by anecdote with falsifiable network science.
Okay, let's wrap this up. We have been on quite an intellectual journey today. We started by looking for a traditional map of global power, and we learned that the old models, the naive idea of total silos, and the paranoid idea of grand unified conspiracies are both illusions. The reality of the modern world is a multiplex relay. We learned that structural power isn't about how many connections you have or how high your degree is. Power is about whether you control the narrow bridges, the marine insurance choke points, the physical supply chain constraints, the obscure program selection gates that everyone else is structurally forced to cross.
And we saw that while the system is remarkably robust against random shocks, it is incredibly, perhaps terrifyingly, vulnerable to targeted stress on those specific load-bearing bottlenecks.
So, how does this apply to you, listening right now? The next time you open a news app and read about a global supply chain crisis, a massive new tech platform launching, or a sudden violent shift in the markets, I want you to fundamentally change the questions you ask. Don't just ask who is the CEO or who is in charge. Instead, ask what resource is actually moving here. Who are the bouncers standing at the selection gates? And what happens to the global system if that specific, unclamorous bridge vanishes tomorrow?
Because finding the bouncer is how you find the actual mechanics of influence.
Exactly. I want to leave you with a final thought, something to chew on long after we wrap up here today. Take this entire macro-level geopolitical framework of institutional power and apply it directly to your own life. Look at your own professional network, your own career trajectory, your own social circles. Are you spending all of your energy trying to endlessly increase your degree? Are you just trying to be a massive glowing hub, collecting a million shallow connections, attending every single networking event, trying to know everyone in the room? Or are you cultivating your betweenness?
That is the real question.
Are you doing the hard, highly specialized work of positioning yourself as the single, indispensable bridge between two totally different worlds? Are you the only person who can translate between the software engineers and the marketing team? Are you the unique bridge between your local neighborhood community and outside municipal resources? Because if the Relay Atlas teaches us anything about the nature of the universe, it's that being popular is a distraction. The bridge is where the real power lies. Keep building your bridges. We'll catch you next time.